This is Mr. Kim! In Unit 2, Part 2, we're studying supplies. So let's go with the joke. Why is the stadium so cold? It's full of fans!
Supply. So the good news with supply is conceptually, it's pretty much the same thing as we went over in our first video of Unit 2, our last video with demand. The difference being is that demand has an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, while supply has a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. So here, if we're looking at our definition for supply, it's basically like the same definition for demand. The difference being is that instead of consumers with demand, we're looking at producers with supply. But pretty much everything about that definition remains the same. So with supply, we're looking at the different quantities of goods that producers are willing and able to sell at different prices. So those two words are still extremely important when we're talking about supply, and even extremely important when we talked about demand here. So here, let's look at Amazon, right? So does Amazon, when they're producing markers, do they calculate into supply if they're not willing to produce markers? Well, the answer is no. So for a producer, when they're producing goods, to be calculated into the supply of a particular good, they have to be both willing and able to produce and supply that specific good. And so with the law of supply, there is a positive relationship between price, and it should not say demanded, right? Instead, this should say supply. That's a typo on my end. So here, with our law of supply, there's a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. So an example, so let's say that we're mowing lawns as a summer job, right? So let's say that if I offered you $0 to mow a lawn, obviously, there's going to be no one that is willing to mow my lawn. But let's say I offered you $5. Well, let's say there's 2 people now willing. But now let's say I offered you $1,000 to mow my lawn. Well, here, a lot of people should be willing to mow my lawn. Let's say 1,000 people are now all of a sudden willing to mow my lawn here. So if you notice, as our price increases, right, or the wage that I'm willing to offer increases, the amount of workers that are willing and able to produce goods are also going to increase. And so that's what I meant by there is a positive relationship. As price increases, the quantity supplied will also increase. And so now that we know, right, sort of what supply is and that there's a positive relationship with supply, with price and quantity supplied, let's talk about shifts. So here, right, we have our supply schedule, right, just like we had our demand schedule, we have our price, we have our quantity supplied. As price decreases, we notice our quantity supplied also decreases here. So here, because there is a positive relationship, right, our supply curve is going to be upward sloping. But now, right, let's say there's something that changed, right, as you see in the yellow on the screen. Well, what if there is a new and more productive milking machine? Well, what's going to happen to our supply curve? Well, our supply curve is going to shift to the right. There's going to be an increase in the supply of milk, right? So just like demand, this is really important to note. Price does not shift our supply curve. Just like how price does not shift our demand curve, price also does not shift our supply curve. And so here, right, if there's new and more productive milking machines, our supply curve shifts to the right because all of a sudden, right, technology became more efficient and we can just supply more milk. And notice, the price didn't change, but overall there is more milk produced. Well, let's look at this example. Well, what happens if the price of dairy cows increases drastically? Well, how is that going to impact our supply of milk? Well, here, our supply of milk is going to shift to the left. It's going to decrease. Why? Well, because farmers or dairy farmers are now they can't buy as much dairy cows because the price of dairy cows increased drastically. And so now dairy farmers purchase less dairy cows, which overall produces less milk because there's less cows here. And so our supply curve shifted to the left. And so if you notice again, there is not a change in price, but there is just less milk produced here. So that's really important to note. And I can't stress this enough for both demand and supply. Price never shifts our demand and supply curves. The only thing a change in price affects is our quantity demanded and or our quantity supplied. Okay, so our price can impact movement along our demand curve, which is a change in quantity demanded. Also, if there's a change in price, it can also cause movement along our supply curve, which we're going to call a change in quantity supplied. If there's a shift in our demand curve and a shift in our supply curve, we just call that a change in demand and a change in supply. So there's a difference in terminology here. Quantity supplied is not the same thing as supply, just like how quantity demanded is not the same thing as demand. And so there are 5 different shifters of supply. The first being the price availability of inputs. In other words, if there's a change in the price of resources, that's going to shift our supply. And we just saw that in our example, right? If the price of dairy cows drastically increases, well, that is going to cause our supply to decrease, shift to the left. And so that is an example of that. Number 2, the number of sellers, right? If all of a sudden there are more sellers in the market, well, that means there's going to be more goods, more supply of that particular good in the market as well. 3, technology, right? If goods become more efficient or less efficient, right, then the technology here. Government action, right? So with taxes and subsidies. So taxes is always going to cause a decrease in supply, and a subsidy is always going to cause an increase in supply, right? A subsidy is when the government gives money to particular industries or particular groups to encourage them to produce more. So agricultural subsidies is a good example. The government gives money to farmers to produce more goods, which leads to an increase in supply. And taxes are relatively obvious, right? The government takes away money, and so that's going to cause just sort of less goods to be produced. And lastly, expectation of future profit. If a company is expecting future profit, right, they're going to increase supply there. All right. And so we do have a guided practice, right? So do this on your own time. And then at the bottom in sort of the comment notes section of the PowerPoint or the Google slide, the answer should be there. So if you have any questions, like I always say, please do not be hesitant, and feel free to actually ask a question in the comment section of this. Send me an email or send me a message through Remind. I'll be more than happy to help you out. Well, that's all I have for you guys today. And I'll see you guys next time when we talk about the elasticity of demand.